My name is Poppy, I'm 32 years old, and I live in Oregon. I've always been passionate about hiking and camping. I've spent most of my life exploring forests, breathing in that fresh air and enjoying the silence of nature. But after what happened 2 years ago, I never walked a trail alone again. Never again. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced in that forest, but I can guarantee it wasn't just in my head. It was a Saturday in September, late afternoon, and I was on my way home after visiting my parents' house in a nearby town. The road was surrounded by miles of dense forest, and I had passed by there many times without feeling anything unusual. But on that day, I did something I should never have done. I saw a small dirt road branching off from the main highway, a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. I can't exactly say what drew me to it, but on impulse, I decided to stop the car and take a quick walk. I grabbed my water bottle, my phone, and headed down the trail. The beginning was normal, with the distant sounds of birds and the muffled crunch of dry leaves under my feet. But as I ventured deeper, the silence took over. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just my steps echoing on the moss-covered ground. I looked at my phone and noticed I had no signal. That's normal, I thought. I kept walking, but then I heard it. Someone called my name. It was a low voice, whispered, saying my name. Poppy. My heart raced in an instant. I looked around, trying to understand where it came from, but there was no one. I stood still for a few seconds, straining my ears, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was my imagination, or the wind playing with the trees. I took a deep breath and continued on, trying to ignore the unease building in my stomach. But it didn't stop. Every 10-20 steps, I heard it again. Poppy. This time clearer, as if someone was right behind me. I turned quickly, but saw nothing but the unmoving trees. That's when I started to feel something was wrong. Very wrong. I picked up my pace, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. My plan was to turn back and leave as quickly as possible. But when I turned around, I felt a chill down my spine. My shadow was wrong. The sun was already low, casting long shadows on the ground, but mine was moving. Even when I was still, it trembled slightly, as if it was shivering. It flickered like a weak flame. My throat went dry. I ran without looking back, hearing the leaves and branches crackling under my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. But the trail seemed endless. I was sure I hadn't gone that deep into the forest, yet the path continued, always the same, as if it were keeping me there. And the voices, they were closer now. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. There were many, all calling my name at the same time, mixed with a low sound, a murmur that seemed to come from beneath the earth. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running. I felt that if I stopped, something would catch me. The problem was, the forest was already dark, and I could barely see where I was going. That's when I tripped over a root and fell. My phone flew out of my hand and slid away. The impact knocked the air out of me for a second, but I couldn't stay there. I quickly got up and searched for my phone on the ground. That's when I saw it. My shadow. It wasn't attached to my feet anymore. It was a few meters in front of me, projected on the trunk of a tree, and it wasn't my shadow anymore. The shape was human, but the arms were longer, the fingers stretched like claws. The head was tilted to the side, and I could feel that it was watching me. I don't remember exactly how I managed to leave. I just know that somehow I ran in the right direction, because when I realized it, I was back at my car. The silence still reigned in the forest, but I swear, I could feel something standing among the trees, watching me. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine with trembling hands. As soon as I pressed the accelerator, the voices stopped, like they had never existed. I got home that night, and as absurd as it sounds, I was afraid of my own shadow. For weeks, I avoided going out after the sun went down. But the worst part wasn't that. The worst part was realizing that even now, sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear my name being whispered. I don't know what happened in that forest. I don't know what those voices were, or that shadow. I searched for answers anywhere I could. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. I began to research stories about places like that, forests known for causing strange and inexplicable sensations. Every search I made, a feeling of dread grew inside me, as if I were digging deeper into something better left buried. On the internet, I found accounts from people who spoke of living forests, places where the ground itself seems to move and swallow visitors. I read about shadows that become independent, about voices that seem to drain life from everything around them. I became more and more frightened, but at the same time I couldn't stop. It was consuming me, so I decided to try something that, to most people, would seem insane. I went back to the forest, not with the intention of finding answers, but to confront what had happened to me. I knew I was taking a risk, but I needed an explanation. It was an impulse I couldn't control. When I arrived, the forest seemed normal. There was no longer that feeling of oppression, no voices, no strange shadows. But when I started walking down the same path where everything happened, the discomfort returned. It was as if something was watching me again. I didn't know if it was fear or memory, but everything felt like a reflection of that afternoon. I kept going, thinking that maybe at least I could understand a little better what had happened. But no. The voices returned, the call, and I heard my name again, Poppy. At that moment, I realized there was nothing left to do. I was trapped there, trapped in the memory of that forest and the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just a shadow or an echo of voices. Something in that forest had marked me irreparably. I never went back. There's nothing left to search for. And even today, when night falls and the silence takes over, I feel the weight of it. I can't prove it to anyone, but I know what I lived through was real. Something watched me in that forest, and I don't know what it was. I just know I can't ignore it anymore. And no matter how hard I try, I still hear my name, to this day. My name is Gregory. I'm 41 years old, and I live in Boise, Idaho. What I'm about to share happened 5 years ago, but it still haunts me every time I hit the road. I've never been someone who gets easily spooked. I work traveling as a sales rep, and I spend more time driving than being at home. Desert roads, cheap motels, and questionable restaurants are just part of the routine. But that night I experienced something that still doesn't make sense to me. I had been driving for over 8 hours, heading from Helena, Montana to Salt Lake City, Utah. The road was long, straight, and monotonous, surrounded by miles of nothing. My gas was almost on empty, and my stomach was growling. When I saw a sign for a diner a few miles ahead, I decided to stop. The place was called Miller's Diner, and the front looked like something out of an old movie. A flickering neon sign, dusty windows, and an old gas pump by the side. There were no other cars parked, but the smell of hot food coming from inside convinced me to go in. The bell on the door rang as I entered, and a group of customers turned their heads at the same time to stare at me. There were 6 or 7 people, spread out at different tables, all eating in silence. I didn't think much of it. The waitress came over to me, a blonde woman in her mid-40s wearing a stained apron. Her name tag said, Doris. She gave me a half-hearted smile and handed me a menu. I ordered a hamburger with fries and a strong coffee to wake myself up. While I waited, I looked around. The place was old-fashioned, with those red leather booths and a jukebox against the wall. But what bothered me was the customers. They weren't talking to each other. They were just chewing slowly, occasionally glancing in my direction. Every time I looked up, I found someone staring at me, but when I made eye contact, they would quickly look away. My food came, and I ate quickly, wanting to hit the road again. When I asked for the check, Doris stopped beside me and with that same forced smile, asked, "Would you like to stay for the special dinner?" I didn't think much of it. I was tired, and something different on the menu seemed like a good idea. I just shrugged and said yes. She nodded and went back to the kitchen. That's when everything changed. The customers who had been silently watching me before were now all focused on me. All of them. Those strange smiles began to spread across their faces. They weren't normal smiles. They were too wide, too forced, like they were trying to hold the expression. My body felt the chills. I can't explain why, but something inside me screamed to leave. The kitchen fell silent. I couldn't hear any clattering of dishes, no sounds of cooking, no smell of food, just that suffocating silence, and those people staring at me. I stood up, threw some bills on the table, and muttered that I had to go. Not one of them moved. They just kept staring, still smiling. Doris never came back from the kitchen. The door seemed miles away, but I forced myself to walk toward it, not running. When I grabbed the handle, I heard the jukebox start playing by itself. An old song began to play, soft but distorted, as if the record was scratched. I rushed out and walked quickly to my car. The diner now looked different from the outside, older, darker. I got in my car, started the engine, and instinctively glanced at the window of the diner. The customers were still inside, staring at me. But now, their smiles had disappeared. I quickly reversed and sped off. My heart was pounding. I drove for a few miles until my breathing calmed down. It was only then that I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. My hand on the wheel looked too pale. I adjusted the mirror to see my face. My eyes were normal, but my skin was getting lighter. It looked like it was starting to disappear. I looked at the window glass, searching for my reflection, and felt my stomach drop. I was still there, but not completely. My fingers seemed less defined, as if light was passing through my skin. The outline of my face was blurry, slowly fading away. I slammed on the brakes, took a deep breath, and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, everything was back to normal. My skin, my hands, my face, everything looked as it should. I continued driving, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, some trick of the mind from a long day on the road. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror again, I swear I saw something in the back seat, a pale silhouette sitting there watching me. I blinked, and there was nothing. I never drove by that part of the road again. I've tried to look up Miller's Diner on Google Maps, but there's no such restaurant in that area. I searched for anything similar, nothing. No photos, no mentions, no records. I asked friends who traveled through that region, and none of them had ever heard of it. But I was there, I know I was, and sometimes at night when I look in the mirror, I feel like my reflection takes a second too long to catch up with me. My name is Matt. I'm 34 years old and I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee. I've never been much of a superstitious person, but what happened on that trip? Well, it makes me question how far our minds can take us when we're alone and isolated. This happened a little over 2 years ago, but even today, the details still haunt me. I'll try to be as honest as possible here, without embellishments, because what I went through seems impossible to explain. I needed a break, something to get away from work stress and the daily grind. So I decided to rent an isolated vacation house on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. The house was huge, rustic in style, but cozy. The description seemed perfect for what I was looking for: peace, quiet, and the feeling of being far away from everything. The only company I would have was myself, which seemed like a good idea at the time. But I soon realized that this tranquility wasn't what it seemed. The first night, everything seemed normal. The house was silent, with a soft breeze blowing against the windows. I was already in bed when I started hearing something strange coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house creaking. You know, those things that happen when you're in an old place. But as the minutes passed, I began to realize the sounds were footsteps. Slow steps, as if someone was walking back and forth upstairs. I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next morning, the footsteps were still fresh in my mind, but I tried to ignore it. I made my coffee, explored the house a bit, and decided to enjoy the day. But when I came back at night, something was different. I had left my coat on the chair in the living room, and now it was on the table, folded neatly. It didn't make sense. I clearly left it there before. I thought maybe I did it without noticing, but things started to pile up. Every morning, a new detail. That's when I started investigating the house. Upstairs, I found an old bedroom that seemed to have been left behind. At the back of the closet, there was a pile of framed black and white photos, pictures of the house, but something was off. In every photo, there was always a person in a corner, partially visible, but I didn't recognize who they were. Curiously, I went through each photo until one of them made me freeze. In the photo, the house looked almost the same, but in the window, reflected in the glass, I froze. I couldn't understand what was happening. The photos were old, but somehow that reflection didn't seem right. I had never been in that house before. Never. But there I was in the reflection, as if I had already been a part of it. What was going on? I was starting to doubt my sanity. In the following days, things got even stranger. At night, the footsteps kept going, but now it wasn't just footsteps. I heard doors opening and closing, sounds of furniture being dragged, as if an invisible presence was moving through the house. I began to feel a pressure in the air, a sensation of being watched all the time. I tried leaving, but whenever I came back, the feeling intensified. And the photos, those damn photos. Every time I looked at them, it seemed like something had changed. The reflection was, I was starting to get paranoid, so I decided to do something I never imagined I'd do. In the middle of the night, I grabbed my phone's camera and started taking photos of the house. I didn't want to see anything weird anymore, but I felt like I needed to document everything. The next morning, when I looked at the pictures, I almost fell backward. In one of the images in the kitchen, there I was again. Not clearly like in the old photos, but my reflection was there, in the glass of the window. While I was out of focus in the background, I panicked. The feeling of being followed, watched, took over me. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore, so I decided to leave before things got worse. I packed my things as quickly as I could and left the house. But the strangest part was, when I was leaving, I looked back, for one last glance at the house that had made me so uncomfortable, and I saw, through the window, a figure standing inside, watching me. I left immediately, not looking back again. The road back seemed endless, and the feeling of something being behind me never left. I got home, but I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. I still have the photos, but I haven't looked at them again since that night. What was happening there? Who was that reflection, and how did all this connect to me? I'll never know. But something tells me that house somehow was watching me. Somehow I had already. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps upstairs. My name is Adam Collins. I'm 38 years old and I live in New York. What I'm about to share with you happened a few years ago during a train trip that still haunts me to this day. It started out as just another ordinary day. I had no idea that this trip would change the way I see reality. It was a fall afternoon, and Melanie, my wife, and I decided to visit my mom in a small town a few hours away. The train would be the quickest and most comfortable way to get there. When we boarded, there weren't many passengers, which didn't seem odd to me. We were used to this on longer trips since it wasn't rush hour. But what caught my attention right away was a man. He was sitting alone, in a far corner of the train car, completely still. The strangest part wasn't his appearance. He looked like a normal man in his 50s, wearing a dark coat with an empty expression. But the way he just stared at me. He didn't speak, didn't move, but his eyes were fixed on me from the moment I entered. I didn't want to be rude, but I felt this growing discomfort. I looked over at Melanie, and she seemed completely oblivious to it, maybe even more at ease than I was. We sat on opposite seats, and occasionally I couldn't help but glance over at him. He didn't look away, almost as if he was waiting for something, but with no expression on his face. The train continued on its path, stopping at a few stations, but at every new stop no one got off. Not even the conductor, who was always so friendly, walked through the car and greeted anyone. He just passed silently, casting a quick glance at the seats. Melanie seemed relaxed, fiddling with her phone, but something inside me was getting more and more unsettled. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. The man seemed to be there with every movement, every sound, in the absence of any interaction between the passengers. As the time passed, I realized there was no one else besides the two of us, and that strange man. No conversation, no gestures. The train car felt emptier and emptier, not just physically, but as if the presence of the people had been ripped away, as though we were trapped in a place outside of time. It was when the train reached the final station that things started to get really strange. There was no announcement. The train just stopped at a dark, empty platform, with no signs of life. I looked out and didn't see a single soul. No one was around except for Melanie, the man, and me. Then, the man stood up. It wasn't like a normal person getting up, but more like someone stepping out of a place they didn't belong, like he was dematerializing. He didn't look back, not at me, not at anyone. He just stood up and vanished. I looked at Melanie, hoping to see some reaction, anything, but she seemed more distant. She didn't seem to notice the strangeness of the moment. The conductor, who had been completely silent until then, simply exited the car without saying a word. I was frozen, not knowing what to do, but when I looked at the seats around me, I realized I was completely alone. The train was empty. There was no one but me. I stood there, trying to process what was happening. The air was thick, as if something was wrong, but I couldn't understand what. I tried to get off the train, but when I stepped onto the platform again, everything was dark, lifeless. I looked at the tracks, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything. The town where the train had stopped seemed abandoned. I went back onto the train, and when I entered again, I noticed that somehow the train had started moving again. I looked around, and everything was empty, except for me. I don't know how long I stayed there, but the feeling of being watched, of being in a place that wasn't mine, never left me. When I finally managed to get off, the town was different. No one was there, as if everything that had happened had been an illusion, or worse, something deeper and more frightening. To this day, I still don't know what really happened on that trip. I searched for information about that train line, about the train itself, but found nothing. No records of an incident or anything that could explain what happened. All I know is that the man, the conductor, the passengers disappeared, as if they had never existed. And since then, whenever I travel by train, I can't help but wonder if it will happen again. If one day I'll get on a train and feel that empty gaze on me.